George will introduce these guys, and we'll go. George?
Thank you very much, BJ. Everybody can hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate you all taking the time today to come to the Avid Panel lecture series discussion. We've got an exciting panel and agenda planned for you in the next hour and a half or so. We're going to include a lot of things like your QA and all of that, so we'll have a lot of chances to get a lot of questions answered. I've got an exciting couple of guests up here, very creative people. And I'd like to start off with my introductions. To my far left is Evan Schiff. Evan is an editor and assistant editor who's been on movies like Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, Pan's Labyrinth, Hellboy 2, Rambo, and many, many more. So from the film side, Evan, welcome. Thank you for being here. And right in the middle, yes, big round of applause for Evan. And in the middle here is Will Files. Will's with Skywalker Sound. He's a sound designer, sound re-recording mixer, everything to do with sound, as you can imagine. He also worked with Evan on Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, which we'll be talking a lot about today. I recently finished up some work on Pixar's new film Brave, Cloverfield, and many more. He's also been anointed, if you will, by The Hollywood Reporter as one of the brightest and most talented 35 and under artisans in the industry, and the recipient of 2 prestigious Golden Reel Awards for sound editing. So welcome, Will. Thank you. Woo. So let me briefly explain again what we're going to do for this session. There's going to be a couple of sections, if you will. First, we'll get to know the guys a little bit, where they're from, their background, things like that. Then they've been so kind to bring us a really cool and exciting sequence from the Ghost Protocol movie. Hopefully you've seen that. How many have seen that movie? Good, good, excellent. So we're going to kind of look at this sequence that these guys put together and talk through some of the challenges that they faced and you know, kind of review the workflow and the process that they go through day in, day out on a film like that. We're also going to talk through some tips and techniques. They're both going to, and I think Evan said last night at dinner, he's going to explain exactly how you get a job in this industry. So we'll talk about, yeah, that's right, there you go. Some of you might want to stick around for that. And then we're going to end up with Q&A. At the very end, we'll have the audience questions and answers. And then finally, in this little bag behind me, I've got a copy of Media Composer and Pro Tools that we're going to raffle off. You've got a little red ticket out there, so that section over there is saying they might be the winning section. The camera person's even happy. So that's what we're going to do, and that's kind of really the lay of the land. All right? So let's get started, and Evan, let me turn it over to you. I guess what I'd like to do is kind of just have you give us a background on where you came from and how'd you get into this crazy, wacky world of film editing.
Well, so I come from Syracuse, New York originally, and I went to the University of Southern California for college, for film school. While I was working there, I also worked at Stan Winston's studio, which was kind of the most awesome college job I think you could ask for. And you know, I thought that I originally wanted to get into special effects, and that's why I pursued first an internship there and then a job. And in my second year at USC, when I started making my student films, I found that I really, really loved actually spending the entire weekend editing and sound designing and really, you know, kind of honing my student films. They were still bad, but they were, but I had fun working on them. And so kind of after that, I started to focus more and more on editing. And when I graduated, I decided that I wanted to, unfortunately, leave Stan Winston Studio, but fortunately go into the production side of editorial. And kind of worked up from there.
Now, so did you know before you even got to USC, I mean, that's what you really wanted to go for? I mean, did you have the bug early on? Were you a film lover early on? And were you out shooting little movies when you were a kid?
You know, it's funny, I didn't do very much film production in Syracuse. I didn't know anybody that was doing that either. I don't think it even occurred to me until maybe my sophomore year of high school that I could make a living out of that, or that people did make a living out of working in the film industry. And so that was kind of a revelation when I was like, oh, I can go to college for this, and I can, you know, do this, I can pursue this career that sounds fascinating and really enjoyable. And so it was really from maybe the middle of high school that I was like, I want to get in the film industry. And yeah, as I said, I thought I wanted to get into special effects, and it wasn't for a few years that I kind of changed and decided I would try editing instead.
So just by a show of hands real quick, how many of you are focused on the film side of things here? feature film editing. How many of you are on the audio side, sound design and not? Wow, big crowd. Giving props to Will over here. Hey, by the way, who's got John Sisti as a faculty member or anybody? Anybody in here? All right, right there. Will actually had John Sisti as his faculty member as well when he was at UNC School of the Arts, right?
That's true.
That's right.
John,
So
where are you?
where are you,
saw you
John?
walk in.
Yeah.
There you are.
You won't recognize him today, folks, because he has black hair. He looks like 30 years younger. He says it's a Halloween skit or something, but I'm not sure.
I think he just wanted to look cool for me.
That's right. You look nice, John. All right, so Will, same question. Same question for you. How did you
No
get your start?
flirting.
How did you get your start and kind of decide that audio was where you wanted to go?
Well, so I grew up not too far from here, actually. I grew up in Myrtle Beach. Has anybody ever been there? Okay. Right. So I know, right? That's the Myrtle Beach corner. That's the airbrush T-shirts and beer bongs corner over there. So I grew up there. I worked at a radio station there called WKZQ. That was my high school job, and so that's where I learned how to do audio production and how to record stuff and all that fun stuff. And then I decided to go to film school because I was doing video production as well. So there was this little film school no one had ever heard of called University of North Carolina School of the Arts, which wasn't, yeah. It's great. Out in California, no one knows what I'm talking about. So I went to school there for 4 years. John was my teacher. We had a great time. Learned a lot and met a guy named Randy Tom who works at Skywalker Sound basically at an event like this. And I pestered him for 2 years into giving me an internship. And so when I moved to San Francisco, he very generously lived up to that offer. And I started interning with him at Skywalker, and that turned into an assistant job, and then that turned into a sound design job, and then I started mixing, and so on and so on. So essentially, that's my very condensed version of why the hell I'm a sound designer. Briefly, I thought I wanted to be a DP because they wear scarves and sunglasses and they get all the girls, but it wasn't really a lifestyle that was really good for me. I spent a couple summers shooting movies in August in Florida, and it's the kind of thing you realize this is not a life that I really want to sustain. So I decided I want to go work in a dark room forever. So that's what I'm doing.
So I'm sure we'll catch more of this later. Hopefully you took a note on that because he did give you a clue as to a tip and technique, pestering. 2 years of pestering. So pestering helps
Gentle
you in this
pestering.
Gentle pestering, right, exactly.
Insistent, but not annoying.
So what was
Fine line.
what was your first real paying gig, when you got out of school? What's the first thing you got the check for that you framed and said, man, this is really
Well,
on my way?
The first movie I was really connected with in any way was I got an internship when I was still in school through one of our professors, David Udall, who was friends with Dave Stone, who's also a teacher here. And I interned at Weddington Productions in Los Angeles when they were working on movies like Ocean's 11. So Dave let me hang out a little bit with him and watched him work. That was one of my real intros to how people actually make movies in Hollywood and how the process of real heavy-duty post-production audio gets done. And it was shocking to me to see, the resources that these guys had. They had this incredible sound effects library that had one guy's job was just to take care of this thing, and to you could ask him for I need this type of sound and this type of sound, and he would bring you 10 examples of each, and that kind of thing. Which that's changed over the years. This was 2001, so now a lot of it's more a la carte. You can do it yourself using SoundMiner. But back in those days, they still even had stuff on reel-to-reel. So you'd have to go to a guy who would know this library and know how to find it. Was it digitized yet? Does it still need to be digitized? One of my first jobs was baking quarter-inch tapes so that they could be transferred back to digital, which, I'm not that old, so that still seemed pretty weird to me. But it was kind of cool to see how these guys were making the transition from analog to digital. There was still people in town cutting on film. There was still people in town, at that point, just a handful of dialogue editors that were cutting dialogue on mag film, which seemed like the most insane thing to me ever. But it was still happening. So it was kind of cool to see that transition.
So Evan, what about you? What was your first real gig that you were super proud of to be on and involved in after school?
I would say after I left Stan Winston's studio, probably the first gig after that would be Pan's Labyrinth.
Not bad.
Yeah, not a bad
Not a bad gig,
at
right?
all.
Yeah.
And,
Good work if you can get it.
People ask me how I got that job, and I can honestly tell you I do not know.
Okay, I'll cross that off my question list then.
Right. I was a member of the Editors Guild. Was kind of killing time as a post-production PA for Criminal Minds, which is a job that I hated. And out of the blue, there's this email came through addressed to myself and maybe a dozen other assistant editors, looking for someone to be an assistant editor on Guillermo del Toro's next movie, and they had to speak Spanish. And I was like, I'll do that. And but to this day, I don't know how they got my email address. I don't know how they knew that I speak Spanish. All of that is kind of a mystery to me, but I'm very thankful that it happened.
So today we're here talking about your film Mission Impossible: Ghost Protocol, and both of your bodies of work really are in this genre of film editing. Do either one of you do any work in television at all, or post-production at all, or is it really strictly film focused?
Yeah, the only exposure to TV I've really had is commercials. I've mixed a few commercials, but that's really about it. I mean, there's not a lot of crossover. Yeah. Usually in Hollywood, you're a TV guy or a feature guy. And part of that is because they are similar skill sets, but they're different. And the guys who do TV sound design, for example, they cut faster than anybody I know in features. And it's not to say that the work is up to the quality of what we do on features, but some of the work they do is astoundingly good. And the fact that they crank out, a 60-minute show in a week is shocking to me, coming from a feature point of view. So I have great respect for the work those guys do, but it's very different than how I work with my team.
Yeah, there's also, I find that there's a lot of, there should be more crossover, I think, than there is. And part of that are some misconceptions maybe on the producers or post-producers' part. So there's a lot of TV editors that would love to get into features, and they go into these interviews, and the feature producers say, "Oh, you've only worked in TV, you don't really know how film works," which I think isn't really a valid excuse. And then on the flip side, there's a lot of feature editors who would love to, keep the paychecks coming once they finish a feature. Because sometimes you've got some months of unemployment, and everybody wants to continue working, and you'll go for a TV interview, and they'll be like, "Oh, you're not used to the fast pace of television," which I think is also not really fair. So my opinion is there should be more crossover, but there isn't a lot.
I know at Skywalker right now we're doing David Fincher's new TV show called House of Cards, and that is interesting because it's directed by him, at least the first couple of episodes, and so he wanted to bring in his whole crew. So everyone that he's usually working with, his DP and his sound designer and the mixers, it's all the same guys. So they're being put basically in that position of, okay, time to learn how to make a TV show and use all your feature skills to make a TV show. And from what I've heard, it's turning out really, really well. So it's not to say it can't happen, but it doesn't happen much.
So you both ended up on Ghost Protocol. So Will, I guess let's start with you. How'd you end up getting that gig?
Well, I got asked by Gary Rydstrom to do the project. He was looking for someone to work with him on it, who was a strong, sound design-oriented effects guy. And so he brought me in, and I worked with him over a period of 3 or 4 months to build the track. And then I did a lot of pre-mixing, and then I worked with him to essentially polish the premixes, which was an amazing experience in terms of, it was almost like going back to film school, because I got to have my work critiqued directly by Gary Rydstrom, who I think is one of the best sound designers, maybe the best sound designer who's ever done it, and best mixer as well. I mean, it's sort of his whole approach, which I've co-opted, is essentially the sound design and mixing are very much part of the same deal. So they're very hard to unravel, which is different than the traditional LA model, but we can talk more about that later. So essentially, I got asked by Gary to do this project, both because I had a connection with JJ and Bad Robot, and I'd worked on Brad Bird's last 3 movies, and also just because Gary and I had been talking about working together for a while. So it was an awesome opportunity, and I'm so glad I did it.
Yeah, and we are as well. And Evan, what about you? How'd you end up on this film?
So
don't say you don't know.
I do know this one. This one I know. The post-production supervisor at Bad Robot is a guy that I actually just met socially quite a few years ago. He was a friend of mine, and I hung out with him. And then when I had some downtime in 2009, I emailed him my resume and said, hey, I'm looking for work. And he hired me just for a week for the graveyard shift on the first Star Trek movie. And that was kind of my trial run for him. And he liked the work that I did, and so Mission Impossible came along, and he needed somebody who was fairly technical to come in, because there's a lot of moving parts in a movie of this size with this many film formats, and they're shooting IMAX and everything. And so he called me up and said, "Can you come in this afternoon?" And started.
So let's
So this guy that we work with, Ben Rosenblatt, is quite a character. He's very much the kind of guy who will say, "Can you come in today?"
Yeah.
And then you'll work for the next 4 months.
Well, the Star Trek job in 2009, I was home with my girlfriend, and it was like 10 o'clock at night, and he calls me. He's like, "What are you doing right now?" And I'm like, "I'm playing Xbox." And he's like, "Well, can you come to Paramount in like 15 minutes?" I was like, "Okay, sure." And that's the way that things tend to work.
I mean, that's part of the freelance lifestyle. It's a little crazy. So there's a running joke that is, if you're out of work and you want to make sure that you get a job, you should book a non-refundable vacation, because as soon as you book it, you'll get a job. But it could be worth it.
Now, one of the things that I'm fascinated with is learning what the tools are that you have at your disposal when you work on a big budget feature like this. Are you on the editorial side? Are you working on Media Composer? Are you using Symphony? Are you using control surfaces? And what is that?
It's all Final Cut Pro.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, boom.
It kind of changes, and I would say the majority of film editorial departments kind of exist the same way that a film production company does, which is very temporarily. So most editorial departments will rent, a half a dozen Media Composer systems and a Unity Media Network, and put that up in a warehouse or a mall. Or I've worked in like a former carpentry warehouse, which was not cool. We've been fortunate on this movie, Mission Impossible, and just kind of generally at Bad Robot, that they're really into being on the cutting edge, and they like to own their own stuff. So they've got an ISIS, and they've got at least a dozen Media Composer systems.
They're up to 20 now.
Are they up to 20? and a Symphony, and yeah. So they've. When I'm at Bad Robot, I have access to quite a lot of equipment. That's pretty fun to play around with.
And Will, what about you? What's the rig that you kind of worked on day in and day out for this gig?
So for me, right now, these days, I'm based on a Pro Tools HD native system, which is great. And then occasionally, I'll also work on a Pro Tools HDX system. So for the big mixes, when I'm doing all mix in the box, HDX2 is great because I have 512 voices. But for my day-to-day sound design and even mixing, native is fine. And with the systems, the Apple system's getting so fast now, it's really not, you don't really need that serious horsepower until you get to mixing. And then you need that just sheer voice count and the plugins and all that stuff. So the other thing I really like about the native system is I'm able to run it on my laptop now. So I can take the same sessions that I would have on my main system at Skywalker, and I can take them down with me to Bad Robot and not lose any functionality. So that kind of thing has really changed the way I'm able to work. So I have even a headphone system that allows me to mix in 7.1. So all I have to do is plug in HDMI to my Retina MacBook, and I'm able to practically be mixing like I mix at Skywalker, but I can do it anywhere. So lately, I've been working with Evan on the new Star Trek film, and I've been down at Bad Robot for about 2 months, and I keep thinking I'm going to have to get a full-blown system, but my MacBook system has been functioning as a full-blown system to the point that I don't even think about it anymore. So the other things I use, I really like having a control surface of some sort. So right now I'm using the artist control. Back at Skywalker, I've got what's the smaller one? I always forget the D command. I always forget which one's which. And then on the mix stages, it's either D control or the Neve DFC. So I guess if I was to answer that in a nutshell, I'd say at Skywalker, It's a full-blown system with D-Command. On the road, it's just a MacBook HD native. But Pro Tools is, I mean, as everybody knows, it's not a sales pitch, but Pro Tools is what everybody uses in post. There's a few people, especially in Europe, that are using Nuendo and things like that, and they're cool platforms. But if you want to work with everybody else in town, you really have to use Pro Tools. And which not that that's a bad thing, but the best thing about it right now, and hopefully we have time to talk about this later, is the kind of stuff that we've been able to do on Star Trek when we're both working in the same building, using the ISIS and all the shared storage stuff. It's so cool because it means the turnovers basically go away. The kind of back and forth that we used to have to deal with, or I should say the hurdles that we used to have to deal with going back and forth are dissolving.
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute now, since you just brought it up. The university here just recently purchased an ISIS system to install over the fall break or winter break. So for the first time, SCAD's going to have visual effects, audio, sound design, and film all connected to a shared storage collaborative environment. So it's going to be amazing, come after the new year how this gets implemented, and I'm sure all your professors are working on that now. But is that, is that collaborative? You mentioned at Bad Robot, 20 systems and ISIS, and your guys are all interconnected. Is that kind of like the new norm when you're working on something like this, or a Star Trek where?
I hope it's going to become the new norm. It's definitely
it's
not
the new
yet.
norm so far. Yeah. We're the only people that we know right now who are doing this workflow, but it's such a cool workflow that we kind of hope other people will adopt it.
And the collaborative shared storage workflow is pretty prevalent.
That's happening.
But how you're using it, right?
So
let's talk about that. How do you guys use it?
So what we're doing that's a little different on this project is JJ had this idea that he wanted to be doing the temp mix in the Media Composer, so that as they were cutting the picture, the mix was evolving with the picture cut. And so Ben and us and our little gang sort of designed a way for us to be mixing in 5.1 in the Media Composer, and I'm able to feed stuff in from Pro Tools, and these guys are mixing it in 5.1 in the sequence.
And you're also getting our before we start on the 5.1 process, you're getting your turnovers just as a linked AAF on the ISIS.
We don't have to copy any media because I'm on the ISIS, so they just send me an AAF, and I just open it up, and all the media just comes over. It doesn't even come over. It's just there. I'm just accessing it directly. Yeah.
So the school right now, the film editors here are using, I think, Media Composer 5.5, right, BJ? That's what it's on today. So 7.1 mixing and
once you
5,
get to all this around 6 and up. And 6 and up has the 5.1 and the 7.1 panning.
Yeah, but there's a lot of with 6.5. There's a lot of cool improvements to the audio capabilities.
It came along just in time.
Yeah, it did. We literally installed it my first week of work.
So, but before you did this working on Star Trek, right? The bottom line, tell us a little bit. What was the different way? Would it typically just go all the way to picture lock and then you just hand it off to Will, Evan, basically?
Well, yes, and that's still gonna happen. The difference is actually in that there's, which maybe a lot of people don't realize, is that while we're cutting, there's still a lot of screenings and a lot of presentations and a lot of times where the movie has to be, even though you're far from having finished visual effects or anything that you would really want to present to someone, you're forced to. You've got presentations for the international department who has to go out and sell, pre-sell the movie in different territories. You've just, the studio has to make sure that they know what they're getting, so it's not a surprise when you turn in the final picture.
And so you can hopefully get all the money you want to make it as good as you want to make it.
Right. So there's a lot of deadlines that you need, where you need to prepare a full quality looking version of an unfinished movie. And the more time that you can give to your director to edit, the better. So what it used to be is that you would have to stop, you would have to tell your editor and your director that you have to stop cutting for a week, basically.
Maybe a couple weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would get to a certain point, you'd stop cutting, you'd lock it for a preview, and then you'd hand it off to the sound department, and they would cut for a week or two, and then you'd do a mix probably for a week. And then you'd screen that mix for the studio or for the preview audience or whoever it was. And then you'd throw that mix away and start cutting again. Maybe you'd take the mix and you'd put a stereo, stereo effects, stereo dialogue, stereo music, and you put that in the Avid, so at least you'd have something to carry on. But it's not anything that you'd be able to really evolve. It would just be a snapshot in time. So the temp mixes of the past were disposable, essentially. and they were still very useful. You still figured out a lot about how the film needed to function from an audio point of view. You did have something you could keep working with, but it wasn't something that you could actually evolve. So what we're doing on this one is we're doing the temp mix in the cut. So that way, when we do our pass, we hand it back to the picture editors. They make cuts. They rearrange whatever they do, whatever they would normally do. Our mix goes with it. So it's not to say it's completely seamless. There's, they might chop the music up and you've got to go back and recut the music so it sounds nice. But essentially 95% of the work that we've done is still there. And we're able to do a lot of the same things that we do in the Pro Tools side. Like we're using RTAS plugins on the dialogue, so there's a basic dialogue chain with some compression and de-essing and that sort of thing. And it's the kind of thing that really makes it sound more like a real movie and makes it feel more like a real movie, so that when you watch it, it feels like you're watching something that feels much more finished, even if the visuals are only halfway done.
And you're saving obviously time, which equates to money, giving back time for more editorial and creative.
You're basically, you're taking the same pot of money that you'd normally spend on a temp mix, and you're spending it over a longer period of time, but with lower costs. So instead of spending $1,400 an hour on a mix stage, you're spending that money, that's going to cover a day's worth of somebody's work, or a couple days, or whatever it ends up being. So it's not necessarily costing any more or any less. I mean, we'll see how it all washes at the end. But I think in general, it's probably about the same amount of money. Maybe it's a little cheaper. The thing that it's really saving on is this frustration level for the director. JJ's not the kind of guy that wants to stop cutting the picture ever. Even when the movie comes out, I think he doesn't want to stop cutting the picture. So for him, it's a real boon, because he's able to just keep working as long as he wants. And the other big part of it for me is that it gives us a lot longer to try things and fail and try again. Because that's a big part of the creative process, is you have to have the room to fail and to try things that are weird and to break things and then have a chance to fix them.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that actually in the next segment, but I don't want to forget the sequence that you brought us today, so let's move on to that. So we're going to play a really cool action sequence that these guys put together for Ghost Protocol. Before we do, and then right after we'll actually kind of dissect it a little bit, Evan, why don't you set us up a little bit, tell us about what we're going to see before you play it down.
Okay, so we have two sections, be a total of probably about 4 minutes. This is the marquee section. If you saw the movie or the trailer, you saw, if you only saw the trailer, well, you only saw probably 10 seconds of this. But this is where Tom is climbing on the outside of the Burj Khalifa Hotel in Dubai, which is the world's tallest building, and he was actually out there for a week, 120 stories on the exterior of the building, just hung by a wire. So it's pretty impressive. And what I'm showing you here is basically that you're looking at what we cut with. So you'll see that there's burn-ins on the side. It's uncolor corrected, but this is how our timelines look to us. Even though when you finally go see the film in the theater, it looks kind of like that. So I know that kind of seeing this look at our footage isn't that common. You see kind of bits and pieces of it in behind-the-scenes featurettes on DVDs, but I figured I would play it like this for you guys.
We decided to play the final mixed stereo version instead of the work-in-progress stereo version, just because I think it'll be more interesting this way.
Okay, let's see it.
So yeah, here it is, and you'll see that I'll explain afterwards, but you'll kind of see the difference between the visual effects and non-visual effects in IMAX and 35 millimeter. So here we go.
You go full screen with it?
Yeah, sure.
is that?
It's a sandstorm. That's a long way off, Ethan.
Shouldn't be a problem. 24 minutes to door knock.
Where's Ethan?
You gotta be kidding me.
So that's our first section.
Yay, nice shot. Oh, wasn't that cool?
I kind of want to go back and watch it again.
Yeah,
It's funny.
yeah.
So before we move on to the next section then, just talk about that little bit of the piece that we just saw there from a video or film editorial perspective. What were some of the challenges that you encountered with that specific piece of
Well,
that sequence?
So with this whole sequence, what we kind of and throughout the movie, but this sequence in particular, because this is kind of the marquee one, is that we face the problem of having to manage a variety of different film formats to account for all the different ways that you could see the movie when it came out in the theaters. So you'll see that we're working with our full frame IMAX here. But most people, when they see the movie, they're going to see it like this. This is how you would see it in a standard 35 millimeter theater or in a 2K DCP. So while we're cutting, you have to plan for all this stuff. You have to plan for how everybody's going to see it and keep that information in the timeline completely up to date. So what we would do, and I'll actually jump to a slightly different section because I've removed my resize effects here. But what we would do is, you can see we have a resize effect on all of our IMAX footage, and so we actually cut as if we cut for the smallest format that you would see it in. So we cut for a 35 millimeter theater, which also had the added benefit of when we finally saw it in IMAX, it was new to us too, because we hadn't ever really watched it in that full format in a full size until we did went through the whole finishing process. So I won't get too technical on all the visual effects specifications and dailies and things like that. But in this one sequence, there's two different kinds of IMAX. There's obviously visual effects in the beginning. This shot, if you see it in an IMAX theater, it actually starts in scope and then expands out into a full IMAX aspect ratio, so that when you're in that theater and you're in front of the five-story tall screen, it really brings you into that format in a way that you don't really notice. Which, not to harp against any other movies, but there's kind of there's different ways where you can jump in and out of formats, and some are more intrusive than others. So we really tried to structure our IMAX sequences and our transitions in and out of those IMAX sequences in a way that when you're watching it in IMAX, you wouldn't be jarred by it. It's not like there are sudden cuts back and forth all the time.
I thought it was pretty smart the way that Brad decided he was going to shoot whole sequences in IMAX.
Yeah.
Rather than just, like, okay, all the exteriors are going to be IMAX, all the interiors are going to be 35, whatever. I think you end up probably wasting IMAX film on shots that don't need to be IMAX because of that, but it puts you in that space of being in that IMAX
Right. And it really
feel.
drives home that this is the important part of the movie.
Right.
This is the part that we really want you to be impressed by, and we're not going to take you out of it by trying to save on shots that might not have the marquee value of this shot, for example.
So was this feature all done film?
Almost entirely, yeah. We had, so we had 35 millimeter anamorphic was the majority of our footage. 8 perf and 15 perf IMAX, which is 65 millimeter when you shoot it. And then we had a little bit of VistaVision, a little bit of Red, and Super 35.
So really having the ability, or at least being knowledgeable on how to handle those formats, work together with them, and how they look and how they must be adjusted for presentation is a huge part of your job in something like this.
Yeah, you know, my job on a film like this and on a sequence like this is, you know, is kind of on a technical level to make sure that the editor can just cut however he wants to do it. If he wants to go in and out of formats, if he wants to, you know, to use any piece of footage that's you know, tracked, and we're not going to get all the way down to the end of the line and realize that something wasn't tracked properly and we don't know where this piece of film is, or we don't know what size it is, or we can't get, you know, A to match B. And so, and then also to go through and to, you know, make sure that we have our scope sizing, our IMAX digital sizing, and our IMAX framing, you know, all in order.
So it's just not cut, effect. It's a lot
Hopefully,
more.
hopefully for the edit, I mean,
In the end.
The point of, you know, when I do assistant editor jobs, my #1 goal is to allow the editor to be completely oblivious to all the things that I'm doing for them. So the editor can just cut and focus on the story and focus on making that a really compelling sequence. And then my job is to take, you know, his intent and what he's doing and make sure that nothing technical gets in the way, and that when it is, you know, to think of all the things that he does have to be involved in, so that like when you go see it in an IMAX digital theater or a scope theater and it's a lot smaller and you've got to crop out parts of the image, you know, making sure that all of that is taken care of so you don't cut off Tom Cruise's head in a scope, you know, in a scope theater.
Right. Well, what about in this specific sequence? What were some challenges that you encountered from the sound design side?
Well, the trick with this scene was that it's not really a traditional action scene. It's not very kinetic. It's all about tension and release, and it's mostly about tension, really. There's not much release until the very end of the scene. So the whole thing was also designed to not have a lot of music in it. Brad really wanted the music to be just the undercurrent of it, and I think Michael did a great job of not stepping on any moments, as he often does. He's very smart about how he writes music to get around the moments that he knows are going to be sound effects driven, so that it's not a train wreck in the final mix. So the whole thing with this scene was, how do you use the few visual elements that we can connect sounds with to drive it dramatically? And so, of course, you've got, you know, the main ones being the gloves. But what you don't see much of, except on Tom's hair, is the wind. And the wind is essentially what we scored this scene with. So especially if you're listening to 7/1, there's layers and layers of wind swirling around the theater. And of course, we're bringing it in and out as appropriate for the drama of what's happening with Tom. You also have things that don't really make any sense if you think about it, like when he's hanging on the wall and he turns around to see the sandstorm approaching. You hear little tiny glass cracks, like as if, you know, there's his weight on the glass is somehow making it crack a little bit or something. It's one of those things that doesn't really make sense, but it adds that little bit of tension to that shot on his face when you just need a little bit of underscore to it. And it's if you do it right, the audience doesn't think, well, I don't see the window cracking. They just feel a little bit of uneasiness, right? And then there was a lot of course, care taken to how we built the sounds of his gloves and what the sort of sequence of sounds was, so that once when things start going wrong with the glove, you understand, you know, what the beeps mean, and even the sound of it trailing off as it, you know, as it floats away in the wind. You know, how funny can we make that without it feeling like a cartoon? I mean, that was that sound we went over and over with Brad, trying to find the right sound, and in the end, it basically is just essentially a flash gun, which I pitch modulated and put a bunch of reverb on, so as it just goes as it floats away. But he didn't want it to sound like Roadrunner. But of course, in some way, you do want it to sound like Roadrunner. You just don't want it to sound literally like it's canned. So that was the kind of thing that we had to, you know, we had to make sure it was dramatically appropriate for the scene. It's brilliant in its conception, but it's really understated. So you don't want to step on it.
So we have all the drama and the build-up now. Let's get to the payoff then. Why don't you play the rest of that for us, Evan?
Let me show you one thing before I do that, which is that, let's see if I got this right. Yeah. this glove.
Speaking to you, Mike.
Yeah, I'm just making sure that I fully get this. With the glove, there was a problem with the timing of it, which is that you didn't want to see the glove too soon. So I'm just trying to pull up an A/B here. Maybe this isn't the shot. Anyway, with the glove, part of selling that gag, is that you can't kind of see it coming. The glove should come into frame the same as Tom does. And so we actually did some work so that you wouldn't see the reflection of the glove or any part of the glove in the side of the building and against the window before he gets up to it, so that you're kind of, it's revealed at the same time that Tom is actually up there kind of looking at it going, oh, there's the glove.
Well, and when you guys watched the scene, for those of you that saw the movie, did anybody ever stop to think, like, why wouldn't anybody in the building see him or hear him? Okay. So that was a big concern of Brad's. He was, it's one of those movie things where it's like he's climbing up, 10, 12 stories, and like, of course someone would see him. That's not a very sneaky thing to do. That's ridiculous. But it's one of those things that you kind of let go because it's a movie. But there was this whole thing that Brad went through. His process about being, I think, a little nervous about that idea was how heavy can we make those hand hits on the wall or on the glass? Because of course, dramatically, we wanted to make them really heavy and sound like whatever those gloves, whatever technology is in there is strong enough to hold up his weight. Yeah. And so we put in these big ka-chunks from an MRI machine. That's the basic sound of the low end of those gloves. And then, of course, it's just us pounding on glass, which Brad really liked, but once he sort of saw it in a whole scene, I think he got a little gun-shy about it. And so we brought them way down at one point, and that ended up feeling like it wasn't substantial enough. And so what we ended up doing was we did raise them back up in the mix, but we took a lot of the subwoofer off of them, so it didn't sound like it was any kind of seismic event, because obviously someone in the room might notice that.
Right.
So that's the kind of thing that you always go through in a final mix, is sort of writing that line between what's dramatically appropriate and what's appropriate in the world of the movie.
And just so I've got it up on the screen here. If you can see on the TV, you can see on the right is our daily. That's what we shot. On the left is the visual effect. So you've got right here the reflection of the glove, which totally killed the joke. If you saw the reflection, because you would see the reflection before you'd see the actual glove. So you'll see on the left side, which is our completed visual effect, that there's no reflection. So it's, not optically accurate, but it sells the joke.
So play it down to the last part so we can...
We're going to skip all the talking and just play the loud part.
Your line's not long enough! No shit!
That was not easy, but I did it. What'd I miss?
There you go. Now, that's just an awesome sequence, though. It really is. Now, when you're cutting something like this, I mean, what level of creative freedom do you have when you're in the editing room? I mean, do you have to follow a real precise script and outline, and is it very directed, or do the people, you know, on films like this, I mean, do they let you have a little bit of creative freedom to kind of come up with different ideas and different, you know, perspectives, like somebody said earlier?
Well, it depends what part of the process you're in. You definitely have leeway. Hopefully, you know, if the process works the way that it's intended to, the editor and the director are in constant contact from, you know, all the way through production, you know, until post-production when the director shows up and they work together every day. Sometimes that doesn't happen.
I was going to say, how often does that really happen?
It depends. You know, Guillermo del Toro comes in and works for 3 hours after the end of every shoot day, even if it's like 11 o'clock at night. You know, and sometimes you know, the shooting process is so arduous that it doesn't happen as much as you would like it to. So in that scenario, what you have to take into account is that you know, the director any director is going to be scared the first time that they see their finished, you know, or their first assembly, the first time that they see the movie in a long form. It's a very terrifying experience. So any creative leeway that you take during that part of the process when they're off shooting and you're just cutting all the dailies together, you want to be very, very minimal. You want to do things that are not going to be jarring. You don't want to take the script, you know, take the story in a radical direction. You basically want to cut to the script, but if there's obviously something that isn't working, or something that is you know, clearly a throwaway, then you can get rid of it. Or if there's something that is maybe a greater change that you really want to make, but know that they're gonna, you know, if you show the movie to them for the first time and they're gonna be like, hey, where's this scene that we shot? You know, it's like, then in that case you'd want to get approval before cutting it.
Would you ever prepare like an alt version or something
Absolutely.
like that?
Yeah.
Just on your own?
Yeah.
On
Well,
set?
and oftentimes, you know, while you're cutting, if you're cutting a scene, you're like, all right, this is the way that you guys wrote it, but it really doesn't work, and this is the way that I think it should be. You know, you put both of those in a QuickTime, you know, send it to them, they'll watch it on their iPad or whatever, and, you know, you'll get a yes or a no. Once you get into post-production, and this is something that I think that it's a kind of a question that I've gotten quite a bit. Once you're in post-production, all bets are off. You know, when you and the director are in the room, you don't need to stick to your script, because at that point it's about what did you actually shoot, what's on screen, you know, how well is the story working. If it's not working, there's no point in sticking to a script that isn't working. So at that point, you can get a little bit, you know, more radical. And oftentimes, you know, when you are kind of working on a problem and the two of you together can't come to the solution, you know, the director, it can be helpful for the director to go, you know, take a breather, go get a coffee for a couple hours, come back, you know, next week, whatever it is, and leave the editor to just go to town and try things that you might, you know, be a little hesitant to try in front of the director, but that could pay huge dividends, you know, if you've got the time to really finesse it and put an otherwise risky idea together.
Same question for you, Evan. I mean, do you find that you get some creative freedom on the audio side as well when you're in the mix?
I mean, the thing that's nice and sometimes bad about sound work is that we're often doing it away from the director, so it does give us a chance to try and fail a lot on our own. And then sometimes, so a lot of times I will use the rough sound that's in the Avid as a starting point, as an idea of like, okay, this is how they want to structure this scene. And then sometimes I'll just say, you know, this just isn't working for me dramatically, like to have the music build up to this moment. The music, I think, should build up to this moment and be out for here and then come back here. So a lot of times I'll actually recut the music and do what I think is correct and send that, like Evan was saying, maybe in a QuickTime or something like that to the director and say, okay, here's a crazy idea. What if we did it like this? Or what if, sometimes I'll even recut the picture and I'll send them, you know, like this double action is really, you know, like that's what happens a lot is you cut the picture one way and then once you put full-blown sound on it, you realize that the cut doesn't work as well as you thought it did, or at least it works differently than you thought it did. And so sometimes in that case, I'll even cut the picture and send an alt version like that.
And you know, what we're doing right now, which we were talking about earlier, in keeping our running 5:1 mix in our Media Composer timelines for our editors to work with, is helping the editors of Star Trek figure out what cuts aren't working now, whereas they might, you know, those cuts might last until final sound begins,
exactly,
and now they're being changed earlier.
All that stuff is being considered much earlier in the process, and it's hugely beneficial to be able to try crazy stuff, stick it in, and then let the director and the editors live with it for a little while in their cut. So that's the kind of thing that is always very dangerous in a final mix if you come up with something that's totally bizarro and they hear it for the first time in the final mix. A lot of times directors really freak out about that. And it's not a very pleasant experience for them because it's like all this new stuff that they've never heard before, and all it is for them is a process of weeding out. So it's not a positive experience. It's not a productive experience. It's a subtractive, negative experience of like, I don't like that, I don't like that, what is that? And it should be much more of a positive, like, this is all great, what if we also did this? And part of that is just the personalities involved. Brad, for example, is a very positive guy, and he'll always say, that's great, but what if we do it totally differently? You know, which is great. As a sound person or any sort of craftsman, it's great to get that kind of feedback instead of like, why are you ruining the movie? What are you trying to do to this movie? So it can go either way, but I think that for me, if you want to get crazy, the earlier you try it is better.
When do you get involved typically as editors in the process? I mean, are you in the pre-production stage ever, or how early on do you actually kind of get brought into a film like Mission Impossible?
Very different for sound and picture.
Yeah, so for picture editorial, I'll usually start work a week before, or maybe even just 3 or 4 days before they start shooting, before their first day of principal photography. If there's like a test shoot going on, sometimes we start a little bit earlier so that we can process the footage from that. When I find out that I'm working on a movie is a totally different question, because I think there's only been one time when I could see a movie coming with more than like a week's notice. And so, you know, like Hellboy 2, I had 4 months notice, which was great. It was also a year outside of the country, so that was really necessary. But yeah, usually it's, you know, hey, we've got an opening, we're starting to shoot in like a week, can you come in tomorrow? Or this afternoon, or in 2 days, or, you know. Oh, and by the way, we're on location in Canada, and so you're gonna have to move there for 6 weeks. So there's lots of things like that happen.
So Evan, or sorry, Will, same question for you. I mean, when do you typically get into the process?
Typically, we don't really start post-sound until usually sometime in the director's cut, usually at least once they're back from production. We don't usually start during production. Though there's been movies where I've made sounds for the director for him to have on set. And he's actually played the sounds to, you know, set a tone or whatever it is. And that's always really cool. I personally love being involved, at least conversationally, before the shooting starts, because there's always an opportunity to say, well, you know, just from the script to say, like, well, it'd be really cool if we did this scene, you know, with no music, and then we brought the music in here. And those kind of conversations, even just as basic as that sounds, that can really change how the director ends up thinking about a scene. And so it's a wonderful thing to be brought in that early. It doesn't always happen. I do think that the process we're doing now, where I'm basically in from the director's cut, making sounds in the picture department, is really useful. Often I would be doing that. I'd probably start around this time, maybe a little bit later in the process, but I wouldn't be as intimately involved with the picture editors and with the director and everybody else involved. So it changes all the time. I've even come in on movies where the mix, you know, the first pass has been done, and you're just coming in to help out with some stuff at the end, you know, because maybe they're not happy with it or whatever. That kind of thing happens all the time too.
So we've done a couple of these in the past where some of the editors actually have gone on the set, and they said it's helpful for them and just to be involved in that entire process as much as they can. Do you find, you know, being on the set or trying to get that involved is helpful to you, Evan, on the picture side?
I try not to go to set if I can avoid it. There's a couple reasons for that.
All the actresses hit on him.
Yeah, exactly. I have a big problem with that. You know, one of the things is that I think there are kind of two editor camps in this regard, but you know, I'm in the camp that I want to make sure that what I'm cutting together, you know, makes sense, and that, you know, if you think of like the geography of a scene, you know, I need to establish the geography of the scene based only on the footage, because that's how an audience member is going to know where they are in relation to everybody else in the scene and the location. So if I have if I already know what the location is, there's a lot of information that I'm privy to that my audience isn't. So that's kind of a big reason. Like I cut a film earlier this year where they shot in a gallery, and I put it together, and I was looking, and I was like, I have no idea where this character's relation is to this other character over here, and I had to try to, you know, piece that together in a way where you wouldn't be just completely and utterly confused at who is looking at who, because the coverage wasn't giving you that information. And then I finally went to this gallery and was like, oh, that wall's over there. Like, it's information that it was good for me to become confused, because then I could fix it. Whereas I might never have noticed that problem otherwise. On the flip side of that, if you're working with a director that isn't as confident or that isn't sure what kind of coverage they need, then you can be a huge help on set by saying, oh, I think you should get an over-the-shoulder and maybe like a two-shot, and you can help them guide their coverage in a way that isn't, that isn't demeaning or isn't stepping on their toes or anything like that, but just kind of assuring that when you get back to editorial, you'll have the footage that you need in order to put the scene together in a way that is understandable and tells the audience all the information that they need to know.
What do you find is the most important relationship on a movie like this one that you guys did? What's the most important relationship to have in the group of people that are working on a movie? You've got the directors and the PAs, and what do you think's the most important relationship to have?
You mean for us?
Yeah.
Well, for me, it's to the director. The most important thing for me is to have the director's trust and have access to his thoughts about the film. I mean, it's hard when you're working with a director who's so busy that you don't have much access, because then there's this whole guessing game of what they want. So the more direct access I can get to the director, the better. And so it's always better the second time you work with a director, because they trust you and you have a shorthand and you know their taste. A lot of what you're doing as any craftsperson is you're trying to channel the taste of the director. It's like Francis Coppola said, a good director has to surround himself with the best talented craftspeople he can find. The real trick is to get them to all make the same movie. And I can see that. I mean, that's the tricky thing, is that you have all these talented people with their own opinions, and then you have to marshal those forces towards the same thing. And so that, for me, is you're always trying to harness their taste and make choices for them that they would hopefully make on their own, or that they'd at least be happy with.
Evan, you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, if you're an assistant editor, then you kind of want to have both a good relationship with your editor and your director, because the editor is the guy that is going to give you the work. More often, I've been hired by a director once, but normally I'm hired by editors. But at the same time, you want to be in the room. You want to be welcome in the room. You want to be asked for your notes. There's a lot of access that can be gained and trust that can be earned, if you've got a good relationship with the people who are above you in the chain. As an editor, then yeah, absolutely. Then it's just really the director. You want the director to trust you. You guys want to get along. You're spending a lot of time together in a small, cramped room. It's helpful if you don't hate each other.
Yeah, you have to get along with everybody you work with, because it's such close quarters, and also you will end up working with, if not a lot of the same people, at least they're friends. I mean, it's such a small community, even in Hollywood, that you really just can't afford to be an asshole. No. You have to be a decent human being to everybody, including the people that are below you, because you might be working with them in a completely different capacity someday.
Well, Will and I just worked, it was a 31-hour day, I think, last week with 2 other guys. It's a good thing we're friends.
Did you know there was a 31-hour day, people? 31-hour day out here? So,
not our longest day, by the way.
Not our longest day.
Yeah, they fly out tomorrow and actually fly back to LA to work. Yeah. So it's going to be another long day for you. So, on this film, you were credited as an assistant editor on this feature that we looked at today. What's the process? Because a lot of these students here are going to get a job as an assistant. It's going to be the first gig, right? So what's that process that you go through to go from an assistant to an editor? What does that look like in your world?
There's a lot of different opinions on that, and so you'll find as you talk to other assistant editors that everybody's got their own idea of what's the best course for them. It's hard. I mean, it's very hard. Actually, the credit that I ended up getting on this was associate editor, because I did do some cutting on it, and the editor gave me that credit as a thank you for the work that I did. And so that's one step, is you work your ass off as an assistant, and hopefully the editor, you build a relationship up with an editor, so that they trust you and they give you things to cut, or if a project comes in like a small lower budget film comes in and they can't take it or they don't want to take it, they'll pass it off to you. So that's, that's probably in the feature world, that's one of the best ways, but it involves quite a few years of, building up those relationships, and, hopefully learning from the editors that you're working for, because there's a lot to be learned from every person that you work with. The approach that I've been doing recently is I'll assist on, big movies like this, and then on my downtime, I'll go cut independent movies that don't have anywhere near, they have a percentile of the budget of, of Mission Impossible. But you get to be, basically a one-man post house, and you're your own assistant and your own editor, and post supervisor and everything like that. But you hopefully, you end up with a product where even if it doesn't release into commercial theaters or makes only a limited festival run, that you've got something that you can show people to say, look, I can edit, in addition to being an assistant, because at this point, and I think this has changed a lot over the decades, but at this point, being an assistant editor and being an editor are two very, very different jobs, to the point where a lot of editors couldn't actually be assistant editors. They're not qualified to. They wouldn't be able to figure it out.
Because on the assistant side, it's much more technically driven?
It's getting it's getting to, like, my job as a first assistant editor is very technical. It's very organizational. I have to know what everybody in every department outside of editorial is doing at all times, what version of the movie they're working on, to make sure that, that I understand that when, Paul Hirsch makes literally a one-frame change a month before the film releases, that means that I immediately have to update, half a dozen departments, call up our DI house. I have to make sure that that change propagates through all these different areas. And so, it's really it's hard when I'm cutting an independent film. I actually like to sync my dailies in the morning, go take a nice lunch, and come back and cut, because it's really hard to switch mindsets from being an assistant to being, doing something so technical, to then flip over and immediately be creative. Because when you're watching the footage to sync it together, you're not watching it for the same aspects that you're watching for as an editor, when you're like, okay, I'm going to put this shot and then go to that one, and then structure the scene this way.
Evan, how about Will, how about, I keep
It's
seeing Evan.
four letters, it's fine,
Sorry.
yeah.
So are you, is that the same scenario, if you will, as far as an assistant on the audio side, or?
Well, it's a little different in a sense, because, well, I guess it used to be sort of like you're saying, Evan. It used to be that the editors or the sound editors, or the top of the food chain, knew more about the equipment than the assistants coming in. Now it's almost always the opposite. Now it's usually that the assistants know more about the platform you're using than the people making the creative decisions. I think probably in audio it's a little bit more, well, not really, actually. I was tempted to say that a lot of the people at the top of the food chain know a lot about the, how to use Pro Tools. Obviously they know how to use Pro Tools, but they rely very heavily on the people below them. I think I'm maybe, as part of the sort of the new guard, who came up with, Pro Tools, and I did have to learn how to cut on a bench in film school, but we never really did it. So, I grew up with Pro Tools. It's in my blood. I can be my own assistant, but for the same reasons that you mentioned, taking a break and having to flip your brain, there really is something to be said for keeping your head in a creative space or an organizational space. And so a lot of times as I'm making sounds, I'll just dump them in a folder, as you've seen. I've got a big folder that says, to be added, and which basically means that they haven't been organized, they haven't had metadata, they're basically I just name the file and I go, I'll deal with that later. Because it helps me not stop the wheels turning. Because you're kind of making these abstract connections when you're trying to design sounds. You're trying to,
You're mentally, same with picture,
Yeah.
you're mentally assembling a puzzle. And if you let yourself get distracted by tedious things, then you lose track of the bigger picture of that puzzle.
It's almost tempting sometimes to let yourself, go down the organizational rabbit hole, because it's almost a relief sometimes from the creative strain, But in terms of how I sort of made the transition myself, so when I got to Skywalker, because of what I learned from John, I knew a hell of a lot about Pro Tools. In fact, I knew more than just about anybody at Skywalker at the time. And keep in mind, this was 10 years ago. So I was able very quickly to use that knowledge to put myself in a very good position, because immediately my boss, Randy, needed me there, because he didn't really he knew the things that he wanted to do with the technology. He knew enough about, like, I want to use MIDI to, you know, perform the train in Polar Express. How do we do that? You know, and so I was able to put together, you know, a system that would let us do that. And so this is the kind of thing that you guys will be asked to do coming in, is like, okay, I've got some idea I want to implement. How do I do it? You know, I need this to be organized. Do a really great job on that. I think organization is a really great thing to be good at, and having that sort of mentality. I was able to essentially make the jump from assistant sound designer to sound designer because Randy had a younger director client who wanted, basically what I'm doing now on Star Trek, wanted someone to go down and work with him in the picture department for a number of weeks. And Randy basically said, I don't really want to do that. So he basically said, how about this guy, my talented assistant, why doesn't he go down and work with you for a while? And of course that turned into a real, quote unquote, sound design job on a movie called Monster House. So that was just one of those great experiences where I was at the right place at the right time with just enough of the right skills that my boss basically trusted me to say, I think you'll do a great job on this and do me proud, and, you know, because he's basically putting his name behind me. So that's the kind of thing that I think you have to work with people that are willing to share responsibility and that trust you. But of course you've got to earn the trust. That's the hard part.
And kind of, you know, my story on Mission Impossible is similar to that, in that I got to cut because one night we were again pulling an all-nighter, preparing for a preview screening in Arizona, and we were a studio note came in at 11 o'clock at night, long after Paul Hirsch had left, saying that, you know, we had placeholder cards in a few spots where we were gonna, you know, maybe shoot a scene later, or there wasn't a visual effect yet, or, you know, whatever it was. There's maybe, I think there were 22 of these cards. And the studio note came in at 11 o'clock at night that you cannot show the movie to the public in Arizona with any of those cards in there. So we called Paul Hirsch, and we're like, all right, you know, the studio has editorial notes that we have to change tonight, and we're screening tomorrow. And Paul was like, all right, Evan can do it. I'm comfortable at home. And so
he lives 10 minutes away.
He does live 10 minutes away. So, which was great. I wasn't complaining because I was like, great, I'll cut. So I made the changes, and thinking that they were only temporary. And about half of them actually made it into the film, because Paul came in and he looked at what I'd done, and then he was like, oh, you're right. We actually don't even need that shot at all. That shot we were planning to reshoot specifically, we can just cut and go from here to there. And so then the day after that, he came in and he's like, all right, so your new job is the night manager. And Paul would leave at 7:30 or 8 or something like that every night, and any editorial request, any note from a producer, anything that needed to be done to the cut after Paul had left the building, I got to do. And
Nice.
that's how I earned my associate editor credit.
Outstanding. So we're going to open the floor to questions in just a minute. Not yet. Hold them just a second longer. I want to ask just a couple other things, because I think it's really important as far as making sure that everybody understands the expectations when they're getting out there. Aside from being an expert in the chosen platform you're working on with Pro Tools and Media Composer, are there other tools that you find that you really should know going out the door? Like for me as an editor, it's always been After Effects and Photoshop. It's just been kind of like a mandatory thing. On the audio side, I'm not familiar enough to say what it is, but is there, are there some other tools that are really going to help you get your first gig as an assistant if you walk in absolutely down with those tools?
You want to start?
Sure.
Probably a longer list for you.
Well, it's more of it's an indefinite list. The more the more you know going in, the better you can position yourself against whoever else they're interviewing for a job. So, like I on a day-to-day basis, I'll use Photoshop. I'll use obviously Media Composer. After Effects, you can get away with not knowing After Effects. A lot of visual effects editors do all of their temp comps actually in Media Composer, because that allows the editors to cut with them, and you're not loading in a fixed clip that has a certain amount of handles. They can roll it however much they want, and if you have to fix your animat or whatever it is later, that's easier to do, easier to do later after the editor is finished cutting than having an editor call you saying, I want to roll this shot, but the effect isn't going long enough. There's, on the film that I was cutting earlier this year, I hired an assistant editor and told him that he had to learn DaVinci Resolve because he was going to be on set doing DIT work and transcoding all of our footage. And the cinematographer wanted to do some basic color correction, and obviously I needed my bins organized and everything and everything put into DNX Media. So this guy just up and learned Resolve in a week. And things like that. There are more and more aspects of post-production that used to be separate that are now falling under the realm of editorial, and not in a way where like we're doing our final color correction or we're doing our final sound mix or our final visual effects or anything like that. But you're expected to be able to do temp versions of everything and to be able to pick up whatever skills you need to know in order to do that. So it's not necessarily like you probably won't be denied a job if you don't know how to use Resolve or you don't know After Effects. It's certainly more helpful to know it going in, but also having the ability to pick it up at the moment that you need it is equally valuable.